Hey there, it's time for the next episode in our Fear, Love, and Creativity interview series, and we have a treat for you today. We have author, philosopher, documentary filmmaker, Jason Gregory. Now, I discovered Jason a little over a year ago. I was looking to study more about Eastern philosophy, specifically Taoism, and I found his book, Effortless Living. Since that time, I've binged his books. I've gotten to be friends with Jason. We have a wonderful discussion that you can watch in a few seconds, in which we discuss how to overcome fear, how not to let fear overtake you in these uncertain times. There's links to all Jason's books, his websites, some other wonderful resources. But if after you listen to this, hell, if you don't even watch this video, I urge you, go to Amazon, check out his books. He's got a wonderful book coming out, I believe in March of 2022, called Spiritual Freedom in the Digital Age, something we all of us need right about now. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jason Gregory. All right, Jason Gregory, thank you for joining us. And this is something you and I have talked about for a while, and I've been doing a series called Fear, Love, and Creativity. And it was an idea I had last year and kind of into this year. And we've done a number of interviews, including this one. We have some more that we're rolling out, really to look at, especially over the last 2 years. You see kind of the split, and it's pretty stark. People who are ruled by fear, who are ruled by the cortisol, and they're in constant fight, flight, or freeze. And then you see people who operate out of a place of love for themselves, compassion for themselves and the people around them, and maybe are a little more willing to have an open mind on things, think creatively. As I like to say, when you're in a state of fear, you're actually stupider, right? Because your survival mechanism is survive versus let's sit back and have a more creative thought. And so we kind of investigate on what's the best mindset, especially in an era where we need creative thinkers, where we have a lot of challenges going on, not just COVID, not just a number of things, right? It would appear, if you don't have a contextual view of history, that the world is on fire and it's never been crazier and all this stuff. Anyways, with that, I want to thank you for coming on the program, and I definitely want to get into books. You've had a huge impact on me. Get into your books, your new book that's coming out, which I think directly relates to this issue of fear during a time of uncertainty. So anyways, Jason, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me on, Curt. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you in the last year. So, and I thoroughly enjoy your work and everything you're doing. So you're also an inspiration to a lot of us as well.
Well, I appreciate that. And you know, I was mentioned offline, I came to your writings last year when, you know, shortly after my wife and I sold basically everything we owned and donated everything we owned and hit the road with our 4 kids. And we've been traveling around, and, you know, I still felt a little bit of that stress, even though we were in the mountains. We weren't quite hermits, but we were in the mountains and we were living there. And I still felt stress, self-created stress about even little things, about this and work and everything. Yep. And so in looking at, all right, how can I live according to what the Chinese call wu wei? And I came to your book, Effortless Living, and really have binged on all of your writings over the last year. And you have a new book, Spiritual Freedom in the Digital Age, which is needed right now. But you know, in the introduction, I talked about who you were in your books, et cetera. And but I'd love to hear. I mean, you are I came to you because of readings on the Tao and the Tao Te Ching, Lao-Tzu and the such. But really, you write about all, not just even Eastern religions. I mean, you write about all religions and bring them in and bring pieces in. And I really love that, because when you really look at the common themes versus the differences of different faith traditions and spirituality, you find those common denominators, and really a light bulb goes off of, oh, okay, that might be what they were saying. You know?
Yeah. Definitely. Well, some of the early readings that had an impact on me was Aldous Huxley, especially like with the perennial philosophy. It's probably one of the best books I've ever read, but I don't know if it had the most impact in my life, but it gave me a clear perspective of, like you mentioned, the similarities within a lot of the spiritual traditions and religions around the world, rather than looking at a lot of the differences, you know, which particularly the Abrahamic faiths tend to look at, as opposed to the Eastern traditions. In saying that, there are differences, but a lot of the common themes stand the test of time, right? Even if we go back into Gnosticism, even if we go back into earlier Hermeticism in Egypt, there's this common theme of like this ultimate reality that we can harmonize with, or that we are actually at the base of our nature. But then that can get, that whole concept can get warped and changed over time, and it has through the Abrahamic faiths. Like, so the concept of God has become like a monarchical version of God. It's become a kingly version of God, as opposed to like in the East, where, like, if you read the Tao Te Ching, it says, Lao-Tzu states that the Tao loves and nourishes all, but does not lord it over them. So we're part of something much greater, and our life is in our hands, so to speak. But the whole idea is, we need to kind of down-regulate this sense of self that kind of is the product of socialization to experience that ultimate reality. So, and to your point earlier about the attitude, and also to the point when you're in the mountains, to get to that state of that ultimate reality, we have to have like this attitude of wu wei, which means, like, it can be translated in many different ways as non-doing, effortless action, intelligent spontaneity, non-deliberate action, all of these ways. But it's really the path of non-interference. It's about allowing nature to run its course, and about you not meddling in the affairs of others and other nations or what have you. It's a real complete trust in the nature of the world, which we could say is very difficult in this day and age, because a lot of things are happening and the world has sped up. And Lao Tzu he's not an idiot. He would tell you to keep your faculties together, but also to you have to really rely on that sort of wu wei attitude as well to even to guide your actions. So, like you mentioned, you felt the need for yourself, Curt, and your family to leave society and to take your life in your own hands. Lao Tzu would probably sit around and clap at that, because he too was one. If we believe Lao Tzu to be a historical figure, he too was one who jumped on the back of an ox and left society. Because he saw the troubles that Confucianism was bringing to the civilization that he was living in, the socialization that was being forced upon the people. And it's kind of ironic that we have all of these systems of thought, these external systems of thought, that we superimpose on ourselves as if they are natural. So we are trying to naturalize something which is artificial. And this is what Lao Tzu's big problem was with societies. And we don't have to talk about that in the modern day, right? We see plenty of that happening. So
it's funny, and you write a lot about socialization and conformity, and socialization equaling conformity. And my wife and I, we homeschool, and the number one question, if you ask any homeschooler that people get it, the number one question is, there's two things that people will say. The first thing is, well, I knew some homeschool kids growing up, and I stop them. I say, don't tell me they were weird. Yeah, how'd you know? I'm like, because everyone says that, right? The second thing, though, is, but what about the socialization? And what I hear in my head is, what about the conformity? I don't even hear about what about the socialization. What I hear about the conformity. And for those folks who haven't, you hear about Confucius, and most people, at least in the West and the US, their introduction to Confucianism, and where they end with Confucianism, is a little white slip of paper and a fortune cookie, right? Some Confucian saying, but I'm probably going to dumb this down and butcher it, but basically Confucius took kind of the principles of Tao and really tried to turn it almost into an organized religion with a lot of regulations and rules and stricture, everything from tying of the feet to shrink them down to whatever. And Lao Tzu was, in modern day terms, kind of, maybe Confucianism was a little authoritarian. Lao Tzu was more libertarian, right? I mean, it probably not an exact science there, but to put it in modern terms, right? Is that
definitely,
fair?
Definitely. You're 100% right, Curt. Confucius took the teachings of the Tao, which, from evidence, it predates the Warring States period. Who knows how long it predates it, but like that knowledge of Taoism, which was in smaller scale societies, existed, right? And then once we got into larger scale societies, where Confucius, was going from state to state trying to promote his philosophy, was a way of trying to sort of induce the Tao within social norms and principles and rules and regulations, where Lao Tzu was like the symbol of the sort of the social rebel, where he was like, no, human nature is fundamentally good. It's the self-cultivation and the socialization process that makes us bad and creates. So like you're creating a rule for a thief, but a thief doesn't exist if you don't, we don't create all of this, the society we have. I mean, we don't want to take that too literally, but like Lao Tzu's point is that human nature is fundamentally good before the socialization begins to warp us and shape us into the people we think we are. So by the time so when we're born, right, our subconscious from 1 to 4 years old is basically completely turned on. So if you're just downloading kids with like cartoons and this and that and everything, that's going to be in some sense who they become. And even further than that, we go through the education process, we go through the so-called culture that we should be a part of, and then we become this what there's two metaphors in ancient China. There's the carving and polishing metaphor, and then there's the uncarved block or the unhewn wood. And so Confucius's metaphor is the carving and polishing one. So he believes that we are beasts from birth, so we need to be shaped, polished, and carved. He didn't have a high opinion of women. That's why they had to constrict their feet, because this was some sort of beauty standard. And you had to sleep a certain way to conform to your role in society. A bit strange, right? Like it's a pretty exact, well, not exact, it's a pretty precise science that or social science that he was trying to impose on people. Whereas as opposed to that, you have the uncarved block and the unhewn wood, which is Lao Tzu's mentality of not cultivating, allowing life to be as it is, allowing that natural spontaneity to come out of the individual, because we all have this, in some sense, this pattern or uniqueness to each and every individual that we can express when we are more aligned with the Tao or more aligned with the way things are, as opposed to, shaping Jason this way or shaping Curt that way. Curt should think like this because he's American, and Jason should think opposite because he's Australian. And, then we create all these artificial boundaries that we know when we're kids don't exist. When we're a kid, we're just running around with our friends at 6 years old, and we're throwing mud at each other and laughing about everything. And, and we're looking at adults as if like, who are these stiffs, So, and that's kind of Lao Tzu's perspective. Like, and that's why he always says that we should kind of revert back to the childlike mind, because it's more of a state of innocence as well, right? Like where we allow things to happen. We don't pretend we know everything, as opposed to when we become adults.
It's funny that you say when you describe Confucianism and the kind of the odd and very exact traditions and regulations and rules, they say, oh, it sounds weird. But it actually, to me, as you were describing, it's like sounds a lot like some Judeo-Christian organized religions of today.
Yep.
And I grew up going to Catholic school, and so there's traditions, there's things you do as rote memorization, and like you said, between 1 and 4, 1 and 7, that uncarved block becomes polished in the way that they want it. Now, something, as someone goes through, obviously Lao Tzu kind of resisted that. There were people probably who went through Confucianism and kind of came over. So someone is 35 years old, 40 years old. And in addition to that kind of deep programming, where they were born as an uncarved block, but then, really changed and sculpted by these rules and regulations and programming, not just 1 through 4, 1 through 7, but like now 20, 30. And every time you turn on, to modern, turn on a TV or watch the news or whatever you get programmed. What do you say someone who's 35 or 40 to get back to being that uncarved block?
Yeah, that's to one of my books, as you know, Curt, is Fasting the Mind, right? Fasting the Mind is one of the great Taoist remedies for that. Now, what is that? Now, fasting the mind was a phrase that was coined by Zhuangzi, who was the second most famous, or equal with Lao Tzu as the most famous Taoist. and he existed also in the Warring States period. And the story in the Zhuangzi, the Fasting the Mind passage, is about there's a ruler in the state of Wei, right? And so Yan Wei, actually Confucius in this story plays the mouthpiece of Zhuangzi. There's other stories in the Zhuangzi text where Zhuangzi makes fun of Confucius, but in this story, he's playing the sage figure because of that period of time. He was considered like the most learned sage, for example. And so Confucius in this story is telling Yan Wei, Yan Wei is telling Confucius, I'm going to go to this state and I'm going to make the rule, because there's a ruler in the state of Wei who's treating the people poorly, and he's rich, and he's just your average day grub, right? And so Yan Wei's going, I'm going to go there and I'm going to make him benevolent. I'm going to make him humble and this and that. And Confucius keeps shooting him down, saying, you've got too many plans and too many opinions about how to change him. You need to fast the mind. And Yan Wei's kind of like, what do you mean by fast the mind? Like, I don't drink any wine. I often go for periods of time where I don't eat. And he's like, well, that's the fasting of the body. That's not the fasting of the mind. You need to fast this thing. In Taoism, it's in Chinese, it's called Qing. So in Pinyin romanization, you'd spell that Qing. And so this idea, Zhuangzi kind of employs, it's from Lao-Tzu, so Maoist logical theory, which is Lao-Tzu was also another sage-like figure in the Warring States period, but he was more like Confucius, you could say. He was, anyway, there's a lot we could say about him, but he had this idea of Qing, where, and this is very similar to in Hindu philosophy and Buddhism as well, where we have this problem in our mind. Well, before I get to that, Qing actually means species-specific essence in Chinese, from the Maoist logical theory perspective. And so Zhuangzi says that Qing actually is a flaw in humans. So, we could look at a horse gallop, right? And the horse's graceful gallop is its Qing. But our Qing, even though we have it, is a flaw. And our Qing, our species-specific essence, is the ability to discern between this and that. So now why he says that is because it's all well and good to discern between this and that, but usually what happens is we overlay that with an artificial linguistic framework that we've been taught with, which creates right and wrong, good and bad, all based on how we see the world personally, right? And so Zhuangzi, or Confucius as Zhuangzi, or Zhuangzi as Confucius, I should say, is explaining this to Yan Wei, that this is what the fasting of the mind is. You have to get rid of this ability to constantly dissect the world up into this and that based on your own opinion. And so this is what the fasting of the mind is. And the lifestyle approach to that is, which I explain in my book, is about not allowing, for example, the news, right? The media are a big influence on people's lives in this modern day. So if we block, because we take in energy through our eyes and ears, right, which affect us. And so if we block that energy from coming into our mind, this begins to work deeper on this ability of this and that, where obviously to couple with this, you want to go into start practicing a form of meditation as well, and actually make it a daily habit, right? I speak about a lot about in fasting the mind and also in emotional intuition for peak performance about these four fundamentals that make us human, which is sleep, exercise, meditation, and nutrition. And if you keep these four lifestyle principles in sync with yourself, then your mind won't be thrown off by the media and by you should be like this or you shouldn't be like that. And it's not as simplistic as that. Like it takes longer and longer and longer to do. Like the whole fasting the mind lifestyle approach is not, you're not going to be enlightened tomorrow, right? But you're going to be at least observant of what's infiltrating your consciousness and influencing and enhancing your Qing to react to the changing landscape. And so that's sort of what Zhuangzi's point is. Like we have to practice fasting the mind, because if we don't, then we're only going to continue to have strong opinions. We're only going to continue to think this is right and that is wrong. And in the end of the day, who was right and who was wrong, And so, and that's where Taoism, in some sense, would have a problem. Well, it has a problem with Confucianism, right? Taoism was a response to Confucianism in some sense. It's a critique of Confucianism, because of Confucianism, I liked what you mentioned before, Curt, the similarities between Confucianism and the Judeo-Christian traditions, right? Like there's this very moral-based rules and regulation society that they build, and in psychology they build, where Taoism is very amoral, because when you peel the layers back of your personality and you dissect the Qing, then you realize that, wait up, like what I think is good, Curt actually thinks is evil. So like who is right here fundamentally? That doesn't mean we should circumvent common sense and intuition and this and that. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that this artificial linguistic framework that we've sort of downloaded as a human through socialization is how we filter society. And so we need to kind of peel those layers away to see reality then as it truly is.
It's so interesting, because when you talk about Confucianism and moral and Taoism and amoral, some people might say, well, what's wrong with morals? What's wrong with morals? But that goes to a fundamental, belief in, well, I guess it goes back to the good or bad, right? Are humans just fundamentally in their nature evil beings that without the help of strict rules and regulations, we would all murder each other? And it's kind of like, well, I have the freedom not to be enslaved. I have the freedom not to be murdered, which thereby means you have the same right. So I'm not going to murder you because I don't want to be murdered, right? And it's funny how humans can be self-organizing in that way to understand that. Yep. But everything seems to be, and that the essence in the Qing being a flaw, right? Because we have that knowledge of good and evil. Yep. Once again, you look at these common themes between different spiritualities. It's like, well, the Garden of Eden, right? And now there's a translation that many are taught in which it's, well, the woman was bad. She tempted Adam, and therefore we have original sin because humans are bad and they have to spend the rest of their life slithering on their stomachs, right? When you could actually really look at it to say, well, kind of the fall, I don't want to say the fall of humanity, but you look at humanity's kind of greatest, and maybe it's that flaw, the essence is that constant obsession with good and evil and right and wrong and feeling we're being judged, which creates a separation, which kind of bringing it all the way back to fear when it's me against you. And we certainly have that context in today's society, right? Whatever side of whatever issue you're on, it's now red versus blue. Here in the US, it's red versus blue, Democrat versus Republican. Now it's mask versus unmasked. It's vax versus vax. Everything separates us, which can create not only anger, but can create that fear, right? Because we're all scared of one another. Yep. Which I guess it goes to that flaw.
Yep.
One thing that I have, it's a question, but also a kind of explaining the contextual history of this, is that, for 2 years, there's been some chaos following like a decade of pretty easy times, in the Western world. Yeah. And so people, the last 2 years seems like it's been an eternity. But like you mentioned, the Warring States period, right? How long did the Warring States period go on? And that was no like fun time to be alive, right? And so it's not like Lao-Tzu and Chuang-Tzu are like living in these easy times, and it's really easy to do this, right? They had a lot of stimuli and inputs and fear and anger going on around them, right?
They did, and it lasted 300 to 400 years, the Warring States period. So I mean, it's generations, right? Like, so it's like buckle in, get ready. Like we're in for a bit of a tough. I'm not saying we're going to go through that with the pandemic, but they did have to deal with probably something a lot more life-threatening than what you and I have to deal with, right? Like with this, this invisible enemy that's out there with us, right? Like, but for them, it was much more prevalent. And in your face, like, because if you weren't falling in line with certain philosophies, you're gonna be an outcast, right? This is why, well, in some sense, why Lao-Tzu left society, right? It's actually easier in this day and age to be an outcast, I would say. But what's more difficult is that you're probably more in the sights of those who see you as a black sheep, right? So, back in the day, like only those in the immediate environment of Lao-Tzu would know that he was a black sheep. But now Curt talking about this online and this and that, it exposes you to thousands of people. They can go, oh man, he's crazy. You know what I mean? Like he's a nutter. But but you're not, And the thing is that with fear, especially with if we use Lao-Tzu and Zhuangzi as an example, like Lao-Tzu symbolized like he had no fear to leave the society, right? Like he didn't feel attached to the society, and he didn't feel like he needed to live up to anyone's expectations. So it was fine for him just to leave. It was a no-brainer. For Zhuangzi, he symbolizes what it is like for us to remain in society, but to be in the world but not of it. So not to be touched by the the motivations of society, and in doing so, he did it with a sense of joyousness, with actually no fear at all. And that comes down to the sense of personality, especially when you look at the Zhuangzi text. There's the whole part of the premise, and this is actually part of Taoism in its essence, is about the dissolution of the identity. It's how do you or why do you view fear? And it comes through the Qing. It comes through then the solidity of this identity that you think you are. But it's a product of socialization. And you're only fearing someone else who is another product of socialization. So it's a bunch of people who are a product of socialization fearing each other because we all don't dance to the same drum. We all see the world differently. We all and so that's where the fear arises. Where Zhuangzi's like, no, you idiots. If you don't identify with your identity and your role in society, but you play it well, you're not that you become a full crazy person. You play the role well, but you know that in the end of the day, it's just a role. And the way of the Tao is to be flexible, which means that, and to have variation, which means that you can move from one role to another, but not be inwardly touched by any of them. Right. And so, but that's again a higher skill that probably a Taoist sage embodies, but it's something that we should all try to emulate in some sense,
Yeah, and that Warring States period, and going back to Wu Wei and all the stimuli, fear and anger that was going on at that time, right? And bringing it back to modern times, when you look at Wu Wei, it's non-doing, but it doesn't mean doing nothing. And it's hard for people to understand in terms of, these were not lazy people, nor were they, there were things going on. They weren't cowardly people, and they weren't by any stretch of the imagination wimps. I mean, no. I don't know about Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, but a lot of Taoists, you wouldn't mess with them, but they don't go out looking for fights, right? It's so how do you, so you fast the mind, right? And that can help you get back to that uncarved block.
Yep.
But how do you, everyone right now, and offline we were talking about the fact that, like everyone today feels the need to be political, and everyone wants to grab the pitchfork and storm, the castle and all that.
Yeah.
How, knowing that difference when things are going on where the Wu Wei, well, but I'm sitting back and they're burning down the city. Do I do nothing? Do I do, where for the people, there's a lot going on. Like, I got to go fight. I got to go do this. I got to go do that. So even if you tune it out, what would the Taoists say in terms of knowing when to fight, knowing when to get involved, knowing when to do that? And how does that jibe or align with Wu Wei?
Well, this is where the interpretation of the Wu Wei with intelligent spontaneity. So this idea of how to act efficaciously with the environment, how to calibrate yourself perfectly to the environment. This is why, within Qigong, Tai Chi Chuan, or even other forms of combat-oriented martial arts, where you're training yourself to react appropriately and immediately to each and every situation. So Lao Tzu's he is saying in some sense that, non-doing, we obviously should avoid conflict where possible, right? But if it comes knocking at your door, you need to know how to respond to that. And so what we have in the world at the moment is we have a lot of people who are very highly emotional, attached to their identity, which essentially means they cannot act appropriately and immediately to each and every situation, which means then that they only contribute to more drama, more chaos, more fear, as opposed to trying to, in some sense, contribute to healing the situation, which is what a Taoist, which is what would be a Taoist approach, right? And so you have this approach, and this is where, like, in some sense, training in martial arts can help for that, like, because you can actually have a psychosomatic response to certain things. Your intuition can be much more attuned to the environment. But this is also part of the Zen Buddhist tradition as well, within Zen koans and that. So, like, the Zen master will give you a koan, and then you, like, they can be really crazy koans, right? Like, it can be like, I want an exhibition of Zen tomorrow. And it's like, hey, what? Like, because Zen is just like being, present, and like, what does it even mean? Like, and so there was one story where the student would go, and this is in Japan, and then he was fretting all night. He's like, I don't even know. Look, how could I please the master? You know what I mean? Like, because they're a living embodiment of Zen. So when he was coming back to the master's house, he saw a frog which was a native to Japan, and very unique. So he picked it up, and he's like, this is it, And so he showed the master, and the master's like, it's too contrived. You had to think about it too much, And so he wasn't acting immediately and appropriately. And so Zen training, in a sense, is to act Zen, is to trying to get you to. Now, you could say, well, what would be the right answer there? Well, it's a story, it's a koan. I mean, you're not meant to get into those sorts of semantics. But the point is that you're training someone to become natural again. And this is especially what Taoism and Zen Buddhism, particularly those two paths, is about, training you to become natural again. They say in Zen to come back to your original face before you were born. And so they talk about all of these sorts of, they have all of these sorts of clever ways of explaining it. But it's all because they want you, and they speak about this in Taoism and Zen as well, about it just being a fundamental paradox, because we are not natural. We've been socialized. We've gone through the rigors of education and this and that. We're taught this is how you see this and how you see that. So always the paradox is, how do you become natural again? This is always
right.
The fundamental paradox. But obviously through training, through fasting the mind, through becoming aware of the socialization process that you've endured, and why you see things a certain way. This is all, but again, what you and I are talking about, Curtis, is something, it can be a bit mind-blowing for people, because it really, in some sense, pulls the rug from underneath people's feet, because it doesn't really give you a chance to have an opinion on a certain thing, or doesn't give your personality any oxygen. And I've seen this personally. Like, I've been to satsangs, and especially in India, and I was at a satsang with Muji back in 2010, and there was an American girl. And so, like, in satsang in India, it's all about, like, the dissolution of the identity, who is the one who judges the world like this? And, like, so you're really trying to investigate and trying to expose this fake sense of self that we believe we are. And, she's like, but that's not what I believe, and this and that, like, and he's like, belief is the problem. It's actually belief that's the problem. And so your belief arises from identity. And so, and then it goes further into it that, thinker of thoughts and the doer of actions are causing all the trouble in the world, and this and that. So this is like a deeper spiritual aspect to Eastern philosophy, which I think a lot of people, if they haven't been sort of softly introduced to Eastern spirituality, if you go from 0 to 100, they have a massive nervous reaction to, what you and I are talking about. But it's a fact of the matter when you think about it, right? So.
Yeah, and we're going to link to all your books because they're great gateway drugs to Eastern philosophy. But also as someone I know who you love is Alan Watts, and reading some of his books, and all of his books, because he explains it in a very simple way. If you Google him, I know they're on Gaia, but they actually have his old videos
Oh,
of
they're
his
great. Yeah.
lectures when he was like on his houseboat or whatever, and he's got the cigarette and he's painting, and
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
it's
I remember
wonderful. Yeah.
that was the Eastern, I think Eastern Wisdom, Modern Living. I think that series was called. And that when you mentioned that, like it brings up an old memory that I'll share with you. Like when I was up in the Himalayas in Nepal, this was before social media and all of this and that. So I'm in a cottage up meditating in the mountains, and the only thing I had was that set of videos on a little iPod. Like, but it was really enjoyable. You know what I mean? At night, there's hardly any electricity in Nepal, but I had enough to charge my iPod, and I'd just be watching Alan, and it was, yeah, like you said, like he highly recommend him to anyone, that is willing to listen to him. So, and again, he's a great gateway drug to Eastern spirituality as well. So,
Yeah, and he talks about it. You talk a lot about identity, and you just did, right? And the identity kind of, you're the uncarved block, and you pick up this, it's like there's the animated movie, the Pixar movie, The Incredibles, about the superhero family, and there's a scene where he goes to the island to save his family. And there's this room where he's walking, and all of a sudden he gets hit with this big black ball that like sticks to him. He kind of looks to it and rips it off, and he's like, ah. But all of a sudden they start shooting these big black balls at him, right? And it overpowers him. And that's, as you described, the uncarved block versus the, it's like we pick up this detritus over time. That's our programming that becomes our identity, to where we believe that we are our identity. Shifting gears a bit from Taoism to a different Eastern spirituality. You had a podcast that is, I recently watched the Matrix trilogy, and it was like, yeah, that was a documentary. But listening to your and dots connect, and if you're in a place where they can connect, and the things come together. But you did a podcast about, and I had, maybe I knew this but never put it together, the word matrix and matter and mater and Maya.
Yep.
And kind of looking at that in terms of identity and the creative and the illusion that we create. Can you talk about that a bit? And because some people mistake it, that they actually think it's that, and who knows, maybe we are living in a simulation, but that it's actually more maybe about identity, and maybe I'm totally butchering it, but
no, you're 100% on. You're 100% on, Curt. And yeah, the word Maya, you look, the translation, they can say, you can say it's illusion. So then people start then to overlay that, so we're living in some sort of illusion, like, and to be frank, in some of the ancient Hindu texts, they do talk about like atoms and stuff like that. Like, it's not like they didn't know that this was sort of like a subatomic reality, but Maya is more so to do with measurement and the identity, as you're alluding to. So the root of Maya is Marta, and as you mentioned with meter, matrix, which are all involved with measurement, right? And so Maya is related actually to the Qing. When you have a look at, so the Qing with the measurement, Maya is about how we measure the reality according to, our sense of self, our sense of identity. So why it's an illusion is because we're measuring the reality. Why we don't see Brahman, the ultimate reality, is because we're measuring the reality according to our own beliefs, right? That's why we only see Maya. And so in it, because this knowledge sort of comes from Advaita Vedanta, which is a non-dualist path in Hinduism. And one of the great sages was Shankara. And Shankara had a phrase in the ancient text of the Vivekachudamani, which he said, it's a paradoxical phrase, right? Where he said, the universe is, he said, Brahman is real, the universe is unreal, the universe is Brahman. And everyone was like, what the hell are you talking about? So the thing is, what the third line explains the two. So when we see the universe as this and that, and so forth and so on, it's Maya, right? It's unreal. But when we see the universe as one whole, one reality, once we don't have this construction in our mind, this built identity, then we see the Brahman. Then the universe is real. So and it's like that old Zen thing, like that old Zen poem where they said, before I was enlightened, the mountain was a mountain, the lake was a lake. When I went away and I was confused, the mountain was the lake was the mountain. Once I become enlightened, the mountain was the mountain, lake is the lake. So life is still the way it is, but it's your perception of the reality that has changed. That there's differentiation and objects and this and that. You're not going to go completely bonkers, but there's a sense of unity, a sense of oneness. And so to like with Maya, what happens is when we go through the socialization process, we build this thing within ourselves called Brahmananda or Brahmanda. Brahmanda is the subjective view or construction of reality. And so once you have a Brahmanda within you, then you see Maya, right? And so in Hinduism, they speak about Shiva as like the destroyer, right? Shiva here being a representation of or an image of Brahman. And so the ultimate reality. So same as Tao. And so Shiva is thought of as the destroyer, but you could say Shiva is really a deconstructor, because what Shiva does is it deconstructs your Brahmananda to heal yourself of this spell of Maya so you can see Brahman. So
it's similar to going back to the uncarved block.
Going back, exactly, back to the original face. So, and that's what it is. See, Maya is this, it's the illusion that we see when we superimpose our view of life onto a reality that's really naked. So the reality is really naked. It's butt naked. But we superimpose our views of it, our Brahmanda onto it. And so we see Maya. And then all conflict and everything arises from that.
Would you say that most people, the mass of people, are conditioned to believe that the unity is the illusion versus the this and that is reality, right? The unity, that's crazy. People talk about that and consciousness and all that. And the this and that, no, we got to be in our faces. And right. Yeah. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say, yeah, it definitely is. There's only small pockets of humanity. And, I shouldn't say small pockets. Like if you go to India, right, there's large, India's not small by any stretch, but compared to like the globe, it's only a seventh, right? Like a fraction of the world that understands sort of what you and I are talking about. And not all Indians understand that too, let's be frank. But a lot of, especially like, and this comes back to, again, Abrahamic religions and this and that, which also in some sense contribute to the cognitive style, especially particularly in the West, where there are believers and non-believers. So instantly when you have believers and non-believers and God and you, there's already this and that. So then God doesn't belong to nature. God is something separate from you. And then your worldview then is shaped from that fundamental belief. Whereas Eastern philosophy flips this and says, God is nature, is a part of nature. You are nature also. The only thing that eclipses that is this artificial programming you've had that's kind of like dirt on the window. You just can't see the sun coming through. And so you got to try and clean that window. Your window here is the mind. You got to clean the mind so the rays of the Tao can move through you, or the rays of Brahman can move through you and use you as it would use you, So what you said is exactly right on, Curt. It's most people are, and actually do in some sense shame people who talk about oneness and wholeness and unity. They say, no, there's not. Look at this situation. They always like try to use examples to try and shame you from your perspective. But then all you need to say to that is, but didn't this and that mentality contribute to that becoming chaos? So like you're trying to say that unity that doesn't exist. But then when I explain to you that the separate mindset is what created conflict and disharmony, you don't want to accept it. You can't have it one or the other, like and that's where you can kind of come back to people with that sort of perspective. Because if we did have a unity state of consciousness, then we wouldn't be drawn into, there wouldn't be separate forms of conflict. Everyone would be getting on with their life in a wu-wei fashion and doing the best we can without having many superficial associations, if any superficial associations, So
it's that you said the this and that mentality creates the chaos, but it's also when it's a this and that and good and bad and us versus them, right? It turns you or someone who's different than me, because now I'm defining ourselves and humans and nature by our differences.
Mm.
Then if we're different, then you might be my enemy. And if you're
Yeah.
my enemy, then I have to fight. And I'm constant. I go back to the fight, flight, or freeze. And something that you've said that I give you credit for, and I repeat it all the time, is that um, you write a lot that we are in a yin deficient society, and maybe humanity has always been for the most part, a yin deficient. Can you explain that a little bit about what that means? People may have heard about the yin yang, and it's a cool thing that they get a pendant for as a tourist gimmick, right? And they hang around their neck. But what does it mean that we're in yin deficient times or a yin deficient society?
Yeah, what that means is, like, to understand the concepts of yin and yang precisely, is that yang is like the masculine energy of the universe. So it's the active force. It's the, there's many ways to explain that. It's the heavenly. It's the yeah. So it's related to doing, basically, right?
Mm.
And it's also it's the heat element within Taoism. Whereas when you have yin is and again, don't mistaken these for gender. These are, when I say masculine and feminine, it's more related to the active and the passive, right? So the yin is the feminine, so it's the passive, it's the non-doing element, and the earthly element, and it's also the cool. It's the energy is cool, right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
it's a cooling energy, and so each human being embodies yin and yang. Like, the whole universe is built of yin and yang. Like, if you look at the metaphysics of Taoism, uh, before the universe was born, right, there was Uchi. Uchi is Tao in stillness, and
Hmm.
then when we moved out of Uchi, that's Tai Chi, Tao in motion. And so through Tao in motion, you have the two polarities, which is yin
Hmm.
and yang. And so that creates everything in the universe. That's why, there are two sides to all coins, right? And so the problem in our world is that because of the way society is set up, success, like, we ought to be at the top of a pedestal. Uh, and this may be a result also of the Western mindset kind of taking over the world as a little bit as well, the individualism,
Hmm.
the competitiveness. And so what happens then is we sort of double down on this being active, right? So we need to be active. We need to we need to chase, we need to hunt. And we need to constantly do this. And so in Taoism, what you learn, especially particularly if you're practicing an internal form of martial arts, is that the Lao Tzu recommends that, we need to know, he actually says, know the male, but stick to the female. So know the yang, but stick to the yin is what
Hmm.
actually said in Chinese. And so what that means is we should reside more in the yin and conservatively be active,
Hmm.
right? So be active when we need to be active, but not burn ourselves out and contribute to uh, more chaos in the world, more heat. And a lot of people, when they say hot-headed, they really are hot-headed. The heat, the energy is up in their mind, and
Yeah.
you know, and it's not just a metaphor; it's an actuality, right? And so the heat is up here. All of the energy is in their mind. They're emotional. They're go-getters. They're out there. They're doing this. They're doing that, and they can't pull the plug on their life just to be calm and to be shanti, right? And so to be peaceful, and and so in Taoism they talk about the world in some sense. What you said is right, Kurt. Has always in some sense been yin deficient, where we've kind of turned away from uh, rest and digest, and
Yeah.
we're locked into fight or flight, right? Fight or flight is where we live, and so in a young dominant world, we're constantly in fight or flight. So we're constantly agitated and anxious, and we're out there and we're trying to, and what this does is it burns your system out. And so, in the nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And so the sympathetic nervous system is linked to yang, and the parasympathetic nervous system is linked to yin. And so
Hmm.
the more you live a healthier, holistic lifestyle, the more you are a much more balanced person. So the more you activate the parasympathetic, the more you are accessing the yin, and that's when you're much more tranquil, much more present, much more able to deal with the situations at hand. But when you live in a yang dominant world, you're constantly turning the sympathetic nervous system on, which means then you're constantly agitated, you're constantly doing, and all that does is burn you out. You don't have a healthy balance of, of conservatively applying the yang and remaining mainly in the yin. And so,
Yeah.
and that's why in Taoism, one of the big focuses is on humility, right? The Tao Te Ching is basically a book of humility. And so this is why Lao-Tzu always uses the feminine, the valley spirit, the bellows, all of these things that are empty and soft. He uses as a positive metaphor, as opposed to like in Western philosophy, we wouldn't use those as positive metaphors. Humility can be related to humiliation, and we so forth and so on, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
which is very strange from the Eastern perspective, but we have to access more of the yin. So
Yeah, it's I boxed for several years, and we had a coach who said boxing's very simple: hit and don't get hit. And it's like I think of the hitting as the yang, and don't get hit, right? And there's some boxers who weren't strikers; they were very yin boxers, like Floyd Mayweather's, and that's a criticism of him. But people don't realize that when he wants to give you some yang, you're in trouble. But he doesn't.
exactly.
He conserves his energy, and
you could just say then that he's a smarter boxer, right? Like he's conserving more of the yin, and and actually in boxing, if you understand boxing, part of the skill of boxing is avoiding being punched most of the time, right? Like, so we should be giving that credit as well. Like, okay, Floyd's not the most exciting fighter. Like, he doesn't go out there and just start banging on, but you've got to admire his evasive skills.
Yeah.
And that's an ability of yin. And
yeah, and there's entire martial arts, right? Like Aikido, right? That are completely yin, right? You come to me and I'm going to roll you over, and you don't even know what happens, right? No punches, kicks, and people kind of shit all over those because they're not exciting, and kicks, and you don't do the Jean-Claude Van Damme splits, but it's pretty effective.
It is effective, yeah. Well, it's and that's the thing. Like, part of, and I mentioned this actually. I think I mentioned this in Fasting the Mind. Part of the to talk about yin and to talk about being receptive is that in martial arts, especially the martial arts that arose from China, is all about how to fall. It's about how to move with the blow, as opposed to standing frozen where you receive it and you get bludgeoned, right? And so I mentioned in the book about my wife's brother, my brother-in-law, Sungyu, when he was younger and he was practicing Hapkido, which is very similar to Aikido. All he did for the first few months was learn how to fall, and he was really angry. He's a 7-year-old watching all of these kung fu movies and this and that, and he wants to go out there and belt it, right? But then all he learns is how to fall for 3 months, and he's like complaining to his mom and dad, and it's like, but that's the most important part of the skill, is to learn how to move with the blow. Because if you don't learn how to move with the blow, you're going to get knocked out. So you got to learn how to be flexible. And this is, again, embracing the yin. It's about, when you're embracing the yin, like you mentioned before, Curt, is that when use boxing as the analogy, that's your strikes are being appropriate and immediate to the situation. So you're not just going out there swinging like this, because you're just going to get KO'd doing that. But if you go out there and you bide your time, and then you see the opportunity arise, right? Like that's a metaphor for our life. Like, all of these metaphors in Taoism, their concepts are all about how all of us can live skillfully in our life, as opposed to, a lot of us are living very clumsily in our life and in the modern day.
Yeah. And that when you fast the mind, I mean, part of that, and you mentioned the meditating every day, is that breath and kind of lowering that cortisol, right? And kind of, and bringing it down. So you're not, like you said, hotheads. We're out there. We want to go swing. We wake up because we're always told that happiness is right around the corner. I mean, it keeps, it's like Winston Churchill had a quote about democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And it's kind of like, capitalism is kind of the same way, right? I prefer a free market to an authoritarian market.
course, yeah.
But it also is fueled by us a very yang mentality of, well, I got this iPad, but I need the next iPad. I need this, but I need something bigger. And when you wake up, that goes to the Yin deficient as well. And it's like, it's the onus is on us, right? To get ourselves into there it's like eating sugar all the time, right? It's a fast burning fuel. If you're fat adapted, you can go all day without eating. If you're sugar adapted,
100%.
It's that stimulus, it burns, and then you want more, you want more, you want more.
Yeah.
So being Yin.
And sugar contributes to, again, if you look at it psychosomatically, it contributes to the yang. It contributes to being agitated. It contributes. And so what people are doing, like they're going home after work, right? So their sympathetic nervous system's been turned on all day. They've been go-getters all day. They go home, they smash a couple of donuts, eat a pizza, and they're watching Netflix. And all you're doing, even though you think you're sitting down and you think you're relaxing, your sympathetic nervous system's turned on. You're young. You're not really relaxing. The sugar's making you anxious. We could go on about sugar, right? Like the negative effects of sugar. But like, this is why Taoist, especially even Taoist diets, were geared more towards being fat adapted, And so, and even if you look at Tibetan cultures, right? Like if you go into Tibet, not just Tibet, if you go to North India, Nepal, Tibet, and I learned this when I was living in the Himalayas, is that you'd go trekking, right, for 10 kilometers, and then you'd pull up, and then there'd be a lady selling tea, and the tea is infused with yak butter. So you have that yak butter tea, and that keeps you going. And actually, the meditation masters in Tibet would use these drinks to calm down, to settle down, to become more yin, so they could go deeper into their meditation practices in the caves up in the Himalayas. A lot of this information is not out there, but if you go there, Curt, you everything is with yak butter, or and it's just it's probably a heaven for you, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah, carnivore, and you would be led to believe that they're all vegan or something like that, and eating
not true
berries.
at all.
Yeah,
Not true at all.
yeah.
No. Even if you look at the Hindu society, like even if you look at Hindu culture, they haven't always been primarily vegetarian. Like that's a bit of a myth as well. Obviously, when we were hunters and gatherers, we were predominantly fat adapted, right? Like it's not like it's always been like from day one Hindus were vegetarian. That's not the case. Like, and there's still a lot of Hindus. If you go to India, if you go to particularly the big cities like Calcutta or Mumbai or Delhi, heaps of people are eating chicken biryani and chicken masala and all of these dishes.
Yeah.
So it's not like the way that we think of it in the West, right? So
right, yeah.
But particularly those mountain cultures, they're very fat adapted. So the mountain cultures over there.
Well, Jason, we've talked about, when it comes to fear and getting in a state of love, we've talked about fasting the mind, some key ways to do that, meditation, getting yourself in that more yin state versus yang, and that you are both versus just one or the other, right? You need both. That moves it forward. And by the way, I think it was you that introduced me. If it wasn't, I'm going to give you credit anyways. But I think you introduced me. Well, I asked you, David Hawkins. Yeah. So you introduced me to him and his book in terms of where true power comes from versus force, and those things. So I recommend that as well. Thanks for you introduced me to a number of people. I think Joseph Campbell. In your writings, and it just kind of opens up this rabbit hole. But then also identity and getting back to that uncarved block by getting rid of that detritus. A question I have for you, and kind of introduce, in the intro, and we're going to have all your books and everything, but most people, and you're in Australia, so you grew up in Western society. Yeah. Most people don't grow up and say, when I get older, I'm going to be a philosopher. And if they do, it's probably like Greek philosophy or something, right? In the Western world. You're an author and philosopher. How did that come about? And you've lived, you already talked about living in Tibet and in the mountains, and I know Thailand and all around. How did you come to where you are now through that journey?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't by choice. I can tell you that. I mean, it wasn't by me intentionally doing it, I should say. It really just came about by traveling. I mean, I had
Mm,
interest in philosophy, when I was younger, but I never thought it would, I never thought it was anything outside of a curiosity. It wasn't like, because when I was a kid, my mother and father weren't religious. Like, I didn't grow up in a religious home.
mhm,
Um, all I loved to do when I was younger was sport. So, like, all I was playing when I was a kid was rugby league, and all I thought about was like, I'm going to be a professional player when I was older. And when those realities hit when I was a bit older and I wasn't going to be, then my life my life went in a different direction. But it really came about more so with when I met my wife and we started traveling and we moved over to Asia. She always told me a lot about India, right? And I never thought about India, like I watched the Indian cricket team, like they and stuff like that. But I didn't think about India per se. I mean, obviously I knew about the philosophies, but I
mhm,
had not fallen down that rabbit hole. And so basically all that happened was we moved to India. Well, first we were living in Thailand, but then we moved to India. And that was just a game changer for me. Like, it was just about being around the people on a daily basis, seeing a different I know now it's a different cognitive style. When I was a lot younger, I didn't really know. But being around people with a more of a in some sense a more of a holistic
mm,
mindset about things, and not being super agitated about a lot of things that we typically would be in the West. And like it just had such a deep effect on me. Like, not just the fact of going to ashrams or monasteries, but being sort of engrossed in the culture for long periods of time. And I mean years, not just a holiday, like going there for years to live and to study. And the study became a byproduct of living there. Like, I was living there, like I've mentioned to you privately before about living in Varanasi, where the Ganga is, or the Ganges River is, where that's famous for. And I was going to like Jiddu Krishnamurti's house, old house every day,
mm,
reading books from Jiddu Krishnamurti, learning Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism from yogis and people of that nature, and just being in that environment and drinking, eating Indian food and drink and just embracing something completely new. And I don't know if it was sort of well, I guess it's in some sense a blessing the way I was raised, that I was never really raised with a lot of boundaries, a
mm,
lot of things that defined me. Like, because my parents sort of just let me gallivant around and do my thing, So they knew I liked certain things and they tried to nurture that. Not that they didn't discipline me and this and that. Of course they did. But we didn't have a lot of social conditioning.
mm,
So when I started traveling, when I came across cultures like particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia, for me it was just like a breath of fresh air. Like, I was just on fire. Like, it was just something that it was hard to explain. Like, I always explain it to people. Like, it just sort of clicked for me. Like when I first went to India and when I first landed in Calcutta, it sort of felt like a homecoming, so to
yeah.
speak. Like, because the people were so easy, and I felt like I could, have a decent conversation. Then, nothing against Australia and anything like that, but like a conversation at a deeper level. So. And that's
Interesting.
sort of how it came together, Kurt. It was just years of living there, years of study. I thought I used to write articles for websites like about 13, 14 years ago about this knowledge. And then it was just a conversation with my wife when we were living in Northern Thailand. I thought, I feel like maybe I should write a book, but I always thought writing a book's a bit of a task, but then it came very easy. I don't know. It's hard to explain. A lot of it came very easy
Mm,
for me. The knowledge came easy. Writing and everything came easy. The ability to dissect. Yeah, some teachers said to me that I had a sort of a unique ability to translate this for Westerners.
mm.
Um, whether they're right or wrong, I mean, I leave that up to other people to decide. But
It was your inner nature, right? And that was Wu in action, right? Easily coming to it rather than grasping.
well, yeah, and I think that you're spot on. Like, I didn't really try to make this happen. It was one of those paradoxes of trying not to try. Right?
Yeah.
I achieved something by not trying to achieve it in some sense. Not that I've achieved anything, so to speak, but like what I'm doing now is just a byproduct of giving my life the space
Hmm.
to to live my life, you know. And this is why I always tell people to travel. It's like they always get confused about what they should do. Like they think they should write books, or they think they should do this and that. And I always say, travel, give yourself the time, open your life up, and actually see what arises within you naturally. What's your, like you said, Curt, what's your inner nature? What's your inner calling? And so for me, it was Eastern philosophy and speaking to cool people like you. And, you know, for other people, it's football. For other people, it's, you know, making donuts. You know, it's different. That's what life's about. There's variation. And I think a lot of people, particularly in spirituality, they think that all people should be the same. But if you look at it from a Taoist perspective, we're all different in some sense. We all have a unique Li organic pattern, that is in Chinese. And that can only come out when you stop forcing your life to be a certain way and you start down regulating your identity. And so what happened to me was, when I was traveling, the Australian Jason can't survive in Calcutta, because it doesn't matter what problems I have on an Australian level, they're meaningless in India. You know, so that's what traveling does. It has a massive effect on your ego. And that's why in the yogic tradition, the yogis never stay at a place any longer than a day, because they say that if you stay at a place longer than a day, then you start to pick up the environment's habits and tendencies. And I mean, and there's an exact science to that, right? Like we pick up the energy of the environment, and the smart solution to that is to be like you and to pick an environment that's more psychologically healthy for yourself and to stay there, as opposed to trying to make it happen in a New York City, for example.
Well, that 1 day rule, it would be healthy to apply to relatives too when they visit. I think there's a saying, it's like 3 days and the fish start to smell or something like that. But
yeah, that's right. It probably
like
starts a bit sooner, right? Like, who knows?
Well, Jason, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and really appreciate our discussion, our long discussion before we even taped. It was wonderful. JasonGregory.org. I'm going to put all the links to your books in the show notes and spread it. But I really appreciate this. Has been a wonderful discussion, and it's so needed from so many people right now. So thank you.
Thank you, brother. And I want to give you kudos too. You know, like, you're doing a lot of great work, like I mentioned earlier, and you know, you're an inspiration to a lot of people. So
well, thank you very
for
much.
everything you do.
I appreciate that.